of us who grew up in the 1970s and 80s, the dream of more Star Wars was just that. It was a dream. Yeah, there was the concept that something happened before Episode 4. I mean, hence that's why it was called Episode 4. There were obviously Episodes 1, 2, and 3, but we never really thought we would get to that. And because of this, I became a huge focus as far as my toy collection on the original trilogy. In fact, that was kind of the rules that I created, was I was going to be diehard, collect every original trilogy figure, and the occasional expanded universe or, anything else that was thrown out there. If it wasn't classic trilogy, it wasn't for me. Now, I did make exceptions to this rule here and there because, well, there were some toys that came along that, even though they weren't from the actual original movies, they were cool looking, and, well, hey, no one can say no to a good Mando action figure, right? But, that was decades off. At this time, Episode 1 was still a pipe dream, and once we knew it was happening and that our Star Wars world was about to be expanded beyond anything we could imagine, the excitement was palpable. There was going to be new ships, new characters, new villains. We were being teased with images and trailers and concept art, and the hype for Episode 1 was huge. This was going to be the movie to tie everything together. We were going to learn how Anakin Skywalker met Obi-Wan Kenobi, and yeah, he was just going to be this whiny little kid, and Obi-Wan was going to be a whiny little pal. Well, whatever. We all know Episode 1 wasn't exactly the movie a lot of classic trilogy fans were looking for, but from a toy perspective, boy, did Hasbro quadruple down. In fact, they had their biggest launch ever for Star Wars for Episode 1, doing over $1 million in the first 24 hours alone. And Toys R Us partnered as the very first Midnight Madness. In fact, in order to accompany Hasbro with the on-shelf date, they opened their stores at midnight, the first moment of the availability, letting fans come in and, well, basically spend an entire year's worth of savings on toys that were going to be worth nothing in a few weeks because there was going to be so many of them. But at the time, this was new and shiny and different. I mean, the branding was different. We now had red packaging instead of green. That was different. I mean, from a color Pantone standpoint. And all the characters were completely new, and we hadn't seen the film yet, and our expectations were high, our minds were open, and we were absolutely willing to, well, eat these toys for breakfast, pretty much, and, serve them to ourselves sight unseen. We had no idea who most of these characters were, but the packaging said Star Wars, and this was a brand new movie. This had been something we'd never had before. Obviously, we're living now in a time where there's a new Disney Plus show on every few months, and we're getting unlimited Star Wars content. At the time, this was completely groundbreaking. And yes, I was there too. I drove an hour and 15 minutes down from college to the nearest Toys R Us, which was in Simi Valley, so that I could participate in this Midnight Madness, and somehow a reporter there decided I was the one they wanted to photograph for the cover of the daily newspaper. Remember when we had newspapers? They got delivered, and, you could read them. So obviously some of the characters for Episode 1 were no-brainers. You had Anakin Skywalker as, a little 8-year-old because, well, hey, if you're trying to get kids into the trilogy, it actually made sense. But these were going to be lifelong characters, right, that we were going to form bonds with. I mean, Rick Oley, right, he was going to be the new Chewbacca, and he was going to be just as recognizable in pop culture and was going to go down as one of the coolest characters ever to pilot the heroes away from danger, and yeah, nobody really cares about him anymore. And that's kind of what it was. It was a lot of hype, it was a lot of newness, but without any context, collectors had no idea who was going to be a hit, which figures were going to be worth buying, and so we pretty much bought them all. And this put the original trilogy on hold. For someone who was an original trilogy fan, sure, I was excited to get new Star Wars, but where was my Darth Vader? Where were my Luke Skywalkers and Hans and Chewies and Ewoks? We had a good 2 years with a tiny trickle of original trilogy merchandise to make way for all of the, celebration that was Episode 1 and new Star Wars movies. For those of us who are original trilogy fans, well, it basically got put completely on the back burner. And the focus, not only from the branding standpoint, the packaging standpoint, and the pack-in features, all got replaced with anything that was about this guy. I mean, he was going to be huge, right? That's why there was so much Jar Jar merchandise. And even the pack-in flash for freeze frame slides got replaced, where we had the ability to look at a character and see them transform from original trilogy to prequel trilogy, well, that was now going to get swapped out for another price hike and another pack-in, the Comm chip. So, along with characters that we were vaguely familiar with from things like the preview figure, we got Mace Windu packed out with his Comm chip, and characters that, well, could have passed for a classic trilogy figure like R2-D2, even though this was the quote-unquote Episode 1 version. At least it was before he could fly and had those booster jets that he never used until he used them. So yeah, Comtech chips. They were basically bases for your figure, but you could then place them on an additional purchase for $20 and get a replica of Obi-Wan's communicator, or Qui-Gon's communicator made out of a Gillette women's leg shaver. And by placing the Comtech figure on top of this $20 additional purchase, you would get a robotic computer-sounding version of their voice from the movie. And yeah, that's pretty much what it sounded like. It was kind of like garbled, okay, it was a little bit better than that. Not exactly a boo from the streets of Agrabah and Aladdin, but yeah, it wasn't exactly technology ready for the consumer, and the giant bulky stand that you had to spend $20 on was very reminiscent of the Force Link starter set that showed up years later with the exact same feature. So for the new Disney Star Wars movies, a version of Comtech was just simply re-updated and re-released as Force Link, where now the chip was embedded in the figure's foot instead of actually having to have a chip base, but you still had to buy an additional unit in order to activate the sound. So pretty much the exact same concept, and I have to say there was absolutely a little bit of humor in the fact that when confronted with the similarities between the Force Link sound effects that required an additional purchase and the Comm Link sound effects that required an additional purchase, the Hasbro brand managers at the time were like, what are you talking about? We've never done this before. What's a Comtech link? Yeah, that basically shows you exactly it is the way brand managers move offline so quickly that the current brand managers over the Force Link 1.0 and 2.0 lines for Solo and episodes 8 and 7 had absolutely no memory, not 7, it was just 8, no memory of, and it just kind of shows that the sheer amount of time that brand managers are swapped around, kind of like musical chairs, as well as new brand managers brought in, that knowledge of what came before is limited. And yeah, there was absolutely no residue left over, and people remembering the context when this sort of got reincarnated as the Force Link version. There were plans to keep Comtech going as 2.0, where twice the speech was going to be added to these chips where you could barely hear the speech in the first place. And there was a look at how this could be incorporated into the original trilogy. Unfortunately, the Comtechs were not the huge hit that everyone hoped they would be, and we only got a very small trickle of original trilogy figures with this feature, which we're going to talk about in the next episode. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and that was the Power of the Jedi line. Although Episode 1 made a ton of movie in the box office, the toys were much more about souveniring, people buying a toy to say, hey, I saw this movie, as opposed to capturing the imagination of a new generation. And Power of the Jedi would come along a year later to combine Episode 1 now with original trilogy characters under one banner. And for those of us who were original trilogy fans, we would get a small handful of figures that would get released under the Comtech promotion, but over almost 2 years, it was a tiny handful, everything to make way for the glory that was Episode 1. But luckily, this was a temporary moment, and a lot more Star Wars was coming down the pipe. Until then, it was time for Babble Babble on Comtex.